The creature formerly known as Stanley. Written by Samuel Collins. Read by James Kingdon. Prologue. Ephemerae formis perpetuum esoris, not to be confused with Thyridopteryx. Ephemerae formis is more commonly known colloquially as the cocoon of unending famine or endless hunger, easily mistaken by those who encounter this rarer species for the common evergreen bagworm. This astoundingly rare creature masquerades as its harmless counterparts, seemingly often for no other reason than some parasitic instinct to spread to other insects or, as theorized in this investigation, to larger species, particularly cave-dwelling creatures such as bats or, rarer still, humans. The cocoon, once broken, contains a single larva almost identical to that of the common bagworm. But should this creature's excretion somehow manage to enter the bloodstream of its host, it will lead to irreparable madness, as the body can only react physically to rid itself of this invasive parasite by any means, even if it means shedding one's own flesh. It has not been documented as to what may happen to the host after an extended period, as in all known cases, the host had wantedly ended their own life far before any further symptoms may develop. My research thus far on this subject has led to the discovery that in all suspected cases, that the body and their dwellings would be burned, destroyed entirely, leaving no trace or sample to be recovered. Although it had been noticed that in some rare cases where the remains of the host have been obtained prior to destruction, that strange abnormalities or deformities had begun to form, none of which have been published officially. In my opinion, this parasitic species demonstrates impeccable intelligence and adaptability, one that I would go as far as to theorize would supersede death of the host, as controversial as this may seem. One that I would very much like to study, despite any mention of the species being accompanied by the singular guidance to avoid at all costs. From the diary of entomologist and natural scientist Augustus Fraun on an expedition through the Americas, later published as A Field Guide to the Rarer Entomological Species in the Americas, Volume 1, 1911. This highly disputed work was eventually mostly disproven, and Augustus Fraun was later wholly discredited. Chapter 1. The Shed. 2000. The boot of the car slammed closed. Josh hoisted the large cardboard box into his arms, the last box to be carried inside. He carried the box through the front door of his new home and into the living room. Knelt inside, amid a cardboard fortress, his wife, Cara, was carefully unpacking and unwrapping various pieces of homeware. Beside her was a pile of discarded bubble wrap and red tape bearing the words "fragile." Josh placed the box on the musty old carpet, then stretched in an exaggerated gesture, allowing his bones to crack loudly. Cara, her concentration broken, momentarily looked up. Her fatigue from unpacking was catching up. She pushed her glasses up onto her head and rubbed her eyes.
"What time is it?"
she asked, stifling a yawn.
8,
he said, carefully stepping over the scattered boxes and rubbish to his wife. He held out his hand to pull her to her feet. She groaned as she stood and faltered slightly.
Legs asleep.
she said quickly, now leaning against her husband as she stretched and shook her leg. With a smirk, Josh swept her off the floor and into his arms.
That's enough for today,
he said with a grunt as he did so. They both giggled. He placed her upright again, careful not to trample anything in their messy, albeit new, living room.
You're right. It's getting late. I need food,
she said, scanning the ground.
And since I don't know where anything is right now,
she said, pulling her askew glasses back onto her nose and turning to face Josh.
Pizza?
Josh said immediately, and somewhat excitedly. Kara sighed playfully.
I don't think we have a choice,
she said, in a fake, disappointed tone. The two kissed affectionately before leaving their new home. As the newlyweds pulled out of the drive, Kara leant over from the passenger seat and rested her head on Josh's shoulder, silently appreciating the beginning of their new lives together. The first few weeks in their home was relatively uneventful. Unpacking, decorating, the odd disagreement about placement of furniture and so on, until finally they were both satisfied and ready to settle once again. That was until, as it often does, a brief outbreak of high temperatures turned their attention to their garden. The house was built back in the 1940s. The garden, Josh commented, looked as though it had not been cared for since around this time. They were told by the estate agents that the previous owner, an elderly man named Stanley, had struggled to care for the garden in his old age before his death. Josh, however, was an avid gardener and was eager to tame the overgrowth into a tidy lawn and neatly trimmed hedges in preparation for summer barbecues. Between the weather and a month's holiday between projects at work, it was simply perfect. At the foot of the long rectangular garden was the worst offender of overgrowth, a conglomerated mass of vines and hedge below an overhanging willow tree, situated in the small patch of woodland behind their property, separated by a, currently invisible, wood fence. Josh knew he wanted to tackle this first. Armed with a chainsaw and arsenal of hedge clippers and other miscellaneous tools, he slowly began to push back the severe overgrowth. After a few hours of work, he reached a wall of vines, thicker than the rest, and seemingly entangled with a structure of some sort. To his immense surprise, hidden in the bushes was an old wooden shed. It was decently sized, large enough for at least 3 other men of similar size and build to himself to stand without touching. He had no illusion of keeping this rusted and rotten old thing, but curiosity to its contents were too tantalizing for him to resist. More so, what intrigued him was there were the multiple planks of wood nailed into the door, in addition to the rusted padlocked latch. Josh first cleared a path to the side of the shed. The glass window was opaque with dirt and grime. Josh attempted to wipe it to see through, but could not see through. Shrugging, but no less curious, Josh squeezed back through the narrow clearing to the front of the shed. He picked up a hatchet from the assortment of tools scattered on the long grass, and in one swift motion struck the rusted lock. The wood around the lock disintegrated immediately, taking the latch and padlock to the ground with it. Josh dropped the hatchet and pulled his thick gardening gloves from his pocket and put them on. He slid his fingers into the jutting seam along the rotting door and pulled. The old structure groaned and cracked, but the door remained in one piece, as the petrified hinges turned for the first time in decades as the door opened, the old nails and planks lifting with the door. The sunlight crept over the contents of the shed. It took a moment for Josh's eyes to adjust, but in an instant, and despite the summer heat and effort from working, Josh's entire body ran cold. Were it not for the terrible stench forcing Josh to retreat, he would have remained glued to the spot in horror. Josh recoiled back and vomited on the ground, flinging the door closed once again. Of course, that was the moment that Kara arrived home to find her husband pale and vomiting in the garden. Her voice called out from behind him.
"Josh, what's the matter?"
she called, suddenly rushing towards him. Josh lurched towards her. "No! Stay there!" Josh shouted, his voice strained from the burning bile in his throat. Kara was taken aback by this sudden burst. Were it not for the sincere panic on his face, she would have taken this as anger. She stood, speechless.
"I need you to call the police. Right now,"
he said softly, stepping closer to not alert the neighbors.
"You're scaring me. What's going on?"
Kara said, her heart beginning to race. Josh went to speak, but faltered, glancing back over his shoulder at the shed, now noticing the rising swarm of flies, investigating the shed.
"There's something in the shed,"
he began, looking back at Kara.
"I think it's a body."
Chapter 2. The Funeral. 1977. It was May, when Stanley's father finally succumbed to his illness. Stanley had taken the day from work to attend the funeral service arranged by his elder brother, Mark, or so Stanley had said. The weather was especially miserable. Stanley recalled how fitting it was. The attendance was scarce, barely filling the first row of benches before the coffin at the local crematorium. So much so, and because of concerns of the wet ground, Mark had arranged for his father to be carried by crematorium staff, or so he claimed. In truth, Stanley knew the reason was simple. Nobody cared enough to do so. In the first seat, there was Stanley himself, a tall, slender man, pushing 50, with thinning, wispy-graying, dark brown hair, patted flat by the rain. His head was particularly thin, with deeply pronounced eye sockets, only barely obscured by his thick-framed glasses. Beside him, his twin brother, a mirror of Stanley, though still with a full head of hair, similarly messily rearranged by the downpour. The remaining 6 seats were occupied by people Stanley did not know. Perhaps they were friends of his father, or of Mark. Perhaps they were only kind souls that attended funerals with poor turnouts. Stanley could not say. Mark spoke first in the service. He swayed slowly to the lectern. He withdrew an old notepad from his breast pocket, turned the page, cleared his throat, and spoke.
"My father was,"
he began. His eyes glanced at Stanley for a second.
"a very private man," he continued. "As many of you know, our mother passed away before I had even started school. My father raised us and imparted the same sense of self-reliance that he carried his entire life. A hard-working man that believed that everyone must work and contribute to the world around them, no matter how hard or tedious it is."
Stanley looked down at his wristwatch to check the time. 11 o'clock. He rolled back his sleeve and looked back up again, Mark noticed this immediately, but did not react.
Unfortunately, his life was cut short by an ongoing battle with his disease. A secret he kept from all of us and suffered silently with for the past 6 years.
Mark began again, a rising sense of bitterness in his voice, before catching the gaze of Stanley. He swallowed, and his tone became more relaxed as he concluded.
I hope we may all take solace in the fact that his pain is finally at an end. I thank you all for being here today.
Mark returned to his seat and crossed his arms quietly, all the while seemingly avoiding Stanley's eyes by staring at the floor. The lectern remained empty. Some other attendees looked around expectantly. Only after a few seconds did Mark clear his throat attentively. Stanley stood, straightened his suit jacket, then quietly walked out of the hall. There was nothing more that Stanley wished to say to, or even about his father. To quote his last conversation with him,
"He is, rather was, a bitter, resentful old fool."
Despite years of seeking his approval, graduating Cambridge University with degrees in applied sciences, with a master's in bioengineering, he still saw fit to lie about his declining health and refused to speak with him until it was too late. Though this is not what infuriated him, for his dying words to both he and his brother, barely a week ago, were that they would also most likely inherit the same fate. Test results that weekend, done by Stanley's colleague, confirmed that he too carried the degenerative disease. Suddenly, the many broken bones in Stanley's childhood made a lot more sense. Images and voices clouded Stanley's mind as much as the downpour against his glasses obscured his vision. Stanley, however, was a man of extreme focus. There was no puzzle, no problem that he could not solve given the time to merely concentrate on the task at hand. The news of an inherited disease may horrify most men, but Stanley was motivated. Chapter 3. The Chimp. 1982. 5 years of progress in Stanley's genetic research, yet a steady decline in his physical health, had culminated in this day. Stanley arrived at the lab early in the morning, well before even the cleaning staff. Naturally, Stanley had full access to the more than adequately sized facility. Nevertheless, Stanley was singularly focused on visiting a repurposed part of the lab where test subjects were delivered. Although typically empty, the night before had welcomed in a new arrival, a subject hand-selected by Stanley, a chimp born with an underdeveloped bone structure in its left shoulder. Stanley unlocked the door to the warehouse and walked unsteadily into the open room. In the last few months, Stanley had begun to experience some difficulty in walking, often dragging his feet and sometimes losing balance. Yet Stanley took great care in his stride to not arouse suspicion. The space had been dimly lit overnight until Stanley arrived. A flick of a switch now bathed the room in a fluorescent white glow. The chimp was startled as it lurched awake with a yelp before cowering in the confines of its unfamiliar cell. The cage was bolted to the concrete floor, only a few feet from the closed shutter where it had been unloaded. Stanley stopped a short distance away and silently examined the creature. It buried its face in its arms, sparing only short, terrified glances over at the strange man looking in. He was numb to the fear on display. Instead, his mind focused not on the cowering and caged animal, but rather on the day ahead. Today would be the first test of serum osteothifrum, or OT19, a serum manufactured from the same genus found in the evergreen bagworm. Stanley had spent the last 18 months on producing a compound that could be applied as a cream. All manner of logistical issues had arisen over the past 2 years with gathering the necessary species samples from across the world, including the critical bagworm from America. Had it not been for the last-minute acquisition of a small collection of bagworms, Stanley may not have been able to procure the chimp on schedule. The basic idea of the first live experiment would be that the cream would bind itself to the bone to form a cast, allowing the bones to develop and strengthen before dissolving excess material back into the body of the patient. Stanley would be overseeing the procedure alongside veterinary surgeons that were recruited for this day. As meticulous as Stanley was, the most contentious symptom of his declining symptoms would be his stubbornly stiffening hands. At 12 o'clock, he scrubbed in and joined the others around the operating table where the now unconscious chimp lay. Stanley cleared his throat and approached. He looked down at the chimp's exposed and newly hairless shoulder.
"Here,"
he said, pointing his gloved finger to the deformed bone bulging against the chimp's skin.
"Expose the shoulder joint and apply the medication here and here,"
he said calmly, indicating several key areas.
"Once applied, the wound must be exposed to the air for a short time for—"
Stanley trailed off. He stared down at his gloved, outstretched finger. It was crooked, gnarled, and backwards. His attention caught again a moment later by one of the surgeons calling his name. Stanley snapped back to attention. He retracted his finger and idly wrapped his hands together. He stepped back from the table and watched expectantly. The veterinary surgeon gave a courteous nod and proceeded with the scalpel, whilst Stanley watched on. That night, as the chimp rested, Stanley returned home. He was intrigued to find several lights in his home already on. This was strange, as Stanley lived alone. Unperturbed, he was unsurprised to see that the door to his home office was open and could immediately see the figure inside. Stanley sighed. He was not in the mood for visitors at this moment, especially from the only person that this could possibly be. He pushed the door open, and there stood Mark. His face was tight and somewhat red.
"What are you doing here, Mark?"
Stanley said, not as a question, but a statement, in his typical exasperated but matter-of-fact tone. Mark merely glared as Stanley sidled past his cluttered desk to his well-worn leather office chair.
"I received an interesting letter, test results from a colleague of yours,"
he said, his teeth gritted and his fist clenched, in his pocket.
"Oh?"
Stanley replied, still not looking at his brother, instead idly rifling through something in his desk drawer.
"Stanley, look at me,"
Mark demanded, slamming his free hand on the desk with a loud thud. Stanley did not flinch. Instead, he softly closed the desk drawer and slowly raised his gaze to his brother. Shadows formed against his sallow face, in the light of the desk lamp. Mark felt a wash of emotion. His jaw untightened a little, but he remained resolute. He pulled his hand from the desk surface as he looked back at his brother.
"Why didn't you tell me?"
Mark asked. His voice softened a little, adopting a more pleading tone.
"Tell you?"
Stanley started automatically before pausing abruptly as he caught Mark's gaze.
"It's none of your concern,"
Stanley continued, nonplussed, now breaking eye contact and seemingly retreating into the shadows.
"How long?"
Mark's voice softened even more, now almost breaking under the weight of the question.
"Started before the funeral. Father merely confirmed what I already knew. Meaning, the inheritance is mine, not ours,"
Stanley said, grimly. Mark's face fell almost as pale as Stanley's, but quickly returned to a deep scarlet in the ensuing shouting match. Mark was furious, incensed by the exposed secret, but Stanley remained unfazed. As he looked back at his brother, he knew that his actions were merely out of guilt and perhaps fear of losing his brother. As dissimilar as Stanley thought himself, there was no denying the connection between them, a connection that can only exist between twin siblings. After almost 2 hours, Mark calmed down, allowing Stanley to explain.
"The first trial was today. In fact, the test subject is likely resting now. If you wish, you can assist me with the observations."
Stanley paused in his explanation. He was looking down at his hand. The brittle bones in his index finger seemed to have become further dislocated without him noticing, giving it the appearance of a crooked stick, now complete with tri-colored bruises to match.
"I believe I could use the support,"
Stanley muttered gently. If Mark was not mistaken, there was a faint glimmer of emotion behind Stanley's calculating persona. Chapter 4. The Imposter. In the weeks that followed, Mark moved into Stanley's home. Stanley was determined to keep a low profile and maintain his condition in privacy. This included his continued research. As such, the brothers devised a plan that would allow Mark to assume Stanley's identity during the day, whilst he himself remained at home. Mark, as Stanley, continued to study the chimpanzee's condition and report his and his colleagues' findings to Stanley. Mark almost raised the alarm when he absent-mindedly asked his colleague if the chimp had a name, a question that raised more than a few eyebrows amongst Stanley's colleagues, who it seemed were just as unfeeling as his brother. The nameless chimp's condition was very much stable. However, on the surface, the malformed arm remained largely unchanged, barring massive swelling and raised body temperature resembling a fever. Uncertainty clouded Stanley's judgment, but finally, after 6 long weeks from the initial treatment, the chimp's entire upper arm almost doubled in diameter. As predicted, the drug had formed a protective cast around the bone. The chimp was observed to be unbothered by its shoulder, as it idled in its cramped cage, hanging against the bars and playing idly with her emptied food bowl. A clear absence of pain or discomfort. An X-ray done later the same week would show that the bone structure in its shoulder now almost resembled that of an average adult chimp. Mark, imitating Stanley, remained calm as the scientists around him celebrated. To him, this meant nothing, not until this could save his brother. The same night, upon hearing of the findings, the brothers agreed that the time had come for Stanley to become the first human subject of OT-19. The first issue arose when it came to administration. Stanley was in an advanced stage of the disease, and it was unlikely that the drug could be applied to his entire skeleton effectively. Stanley, however, had anticipated this and determined that the effectiveness of the drug could yet be tested in an infusion to carry the drug across the body, where it could still infuse into the bone. However, this was admittedly a relatively wild theory. Stanley, however, had grown desperate. Most days were now spent confined to his bed. He could no longer walk. He could no longer hold a pen. Some days his jaw was so brittle that he could not speak. All he could do was sit and think. It was not long before Stanley asked Mark to steal medical supplies and samples of the drug from his lab to bring home. The infusion took place over 12 hours with careful instructions from Stanley. Mark successfully drained the IV bag containing the drug into Stanley's body. When it was over, Stanley seemed even more frail than Mark had ever seen him. Stanley proceeded to sleep for almost a full day afterwards. That night in the lab, something terrible was happening. It started with a small itch in the chimp's upper arm. It did not trouble her at first, and did not stir her from her sleep. Within minutes, the itch became a burning sensation, one that was not in her skin, but deep below. It was maddening, to the point that it was scratching and biting the flesh from its arm. But the burning continued, spreading and radiating into its neck, then its face, then its head. All she could do from her small cage was wail and continue to tear at her flesh. She was in agony, but the burning did much more than cause pain. It had driven the poor beast mad. When the scientists finally arrived the following morning, the chimp was nowhere to be found. The only trace were the chewed remains of the unfortunate night guard found in the hall. The bars had been pried apart, and the nearby window had been shattered. Mark, who hadn't left for the office yet, received the grim news over the phone. He shook Stanley awake at once, and all the two brothers could say to each other was, "What have we done?" The police were made aware of the escaped chimp immediately, though the worst for Stanley and Mark would come that very night. Somehow the chimp had found its way to Stanley's back garden. Mark was in the kitchen. Stanley, obviously, still in bed. The enraged and already badly injured chimp hurled itself against the sliding glass door in Stanley's living room. Mark looked out of the narrow kitchen window to see the chimp clinging to the locked door with all four limbs. Within seconds, he had sprinted into Stanley's bedroom, bread knife still in hand. The horrendous banging and screaming grew louder as Mark tumbled recklessly through the living room. Before Mark had reached the bedroom, there was an almighty crash and the unmistakable sound of the window finally giving way. Mark threw the door open, and in a blur of black hair and blood, slashed wildly with the bread knife, fortunately finding the chimp's back rather than Stanley's arms. The gash did nothing more than momentarily allow Stanley, who was pinned to the ground, to free his arms and push the chimp's shoulder. It was bare, hairless, and the skin was torn away, leaving gouges of exposed, peeling flesh. The chimp wailed, in an agonized pain. Stanley pushed harder, hoping it would recoil. Instead, Stanley's hand pushed clean through the flesh that poured to the carpet in clumps, the texture little more than a liquid. Stanley's stained fingers pressed further, reaching what he thought must be bones. He clenched his frail hand and pulled as hard as he could. With a sickening gush, a puddle of pink, red, and bone-white sludge fell, and the chimp finally recoiled. Mark, seizing the opportunity, lunged forward with all his weight and pushed the chimp aside, situating himself between the chimp and Stanley. For a moment, the cornered chimp did not move, determined not to break its gaze. It did not even spare a glimpse as the flesh on its arm continued to fall under its own weight and broke free from her obliterated shoulder and landed limply on the floor. Still, the chimp glared back. Stanley stared in horror at the severed arm now lying on his bedroom floor. Stanley moved to prod the arm in the smallest motion. This, however, enraged the chimp again, causing it to snarl at Stanley. Mark seized the opportunity and slashed wildly with the knife, but the chimp leapt aside, sinking its teeth into Mark's arm. Mark dropped the knife at once and cried out in pain, attempting to pry the clamped jaws from around his arm. Stanley, who pulled himself to his feet, clasped the knife and methodically sank the serrated teeth of the knife into her exposed throat and tore its neck violently agape. Blood gushed forth at once, staining the entire area. The chimp released its grip and clutched its neck with its remaining arm. The sound of snarls and howls transformed at once to feeble whimpers. The chimp seemed to freeze and examine the two men, then stood and leapt out of the window once again, disappearing into the night. Fortunately, neither of the two men were critically injured, although upon examining the sludge on the carpet, both stricken with horror and remorse. The two brothers devised a convoluted story before calling the police an hour later. They arrived to find a frail Stanley, cleaned up slightly and miraculously free of any wounds from his encounter with the mad chimp.
Dr. Harris,
the policeman on the front doorstep asked.
Mr. Harris,
Stanley replied glumly.
Mark Harris. We were expecting a Stanley Harris at this address,
the policeman said, a curious expression on his face as he furrowed his brow, looking down at his notepad for a moment.
Stanley is my brother. I am the one who called.
The policeman turned around to his colleague, an older woman who was walking down the front path to them. The two exchanged words that Stanley could not overhear. The policeman turned back to Stanley.
My mistake,
he grumbled.
May we come in?
Stanley, pretending to be Mark, showed the police officers to his bedroom, still in ruin. The policeman immediately excused himself upon witnessing the scene. Stanley overheard the man vomiting a moment later. The policewoman had grown paler, but did not leave, gazing over the room and frantically writing down notes. She sparsely asked Stanley questions to corroborate his story. Eventually, she closed the door to the room, explaining that a team will be here shortly.
To clean up,
she muttered, evidently stifling her gag reflex. She turned to Stanley, who was leaning against his cane in the hall.
Are you all right?
She asked, curiously. Stanley almost immediately collapsed, his cane clattering against the wall. The policewoman caught him just in time and supported him to the living room, where Stanley fell onto the sofa. Stanley apologized profusely, even feigning a weakened voice. He explained his illness to the concerned policewoman.
My brother has been looking after me,
he began. The policewoman gave a reassuring smile.
Is there any news?
Stanley asked with what he hoped was a convincing, pleading look. The policewoman shook her head.
I'm afraid not. We are still searching,
she said, somewhat carefully. She cleared her throat.
Is there anyone else who can look after you?
She asked. Stanley let out an exaggerated sigh.
I'll be all right,
Stanley said, with a false smile. The police found the remains of the chimp on the riverbank, not far from Stanley's home the next morning. Police continued to search for Stanley for days. However, when DNA found in the fingernails and teeth of the chimp was identified, Stanley was declared missing, presumed dead. Mark, who was Stanley, at the insistence of the kind policewoman, visited the hospital and declared terminally ill. He managed to convince all that offered their support that he would rather spend his final days at home and wished not to be disturbed. When questioned further, all Stanley would mutter is,
"In case Stanley comes home."
All the while, Mark was hiding in the shed at the end of the garden. Chapter 5. The Hunger. In the weeks that closed the year of 1982, Stanley and Mark confined themselves to their home in a careful, arranged quarantine. If Stanley was correct, he would not live to see another new year. More so, if Mark had indeed been contaminated, then he too might yet share the same fate. Mark was sat on the sofa, the wall calendar in his hand as he leaned it on his lap. He was marking and annotating dates. Stanley saw him mark another date with a clear X. Stanley's condition had continued to decline. He sat motionless in his chair, much of his body tied with bandages to support his limbs. Even lifting a teacup would result in numerous broken bones. Even speaking clearly would dislocate or even fracture his jaw. This, however, gave Stanley ample time to consider his thoughts in these clear moments that permitted him to do so. What he pondered above all else were his mistakes. Not his actions, however. Rather, why had the drug not been successful? Where had it gone awry? Was there something he had not considered? Some contaminant in the extracted sample? Perhaps something in the chimp's health they had not tested for nor considered. Stanley's thoughts were interrupted by Mark. Stanley's eyes focused on Mark. From what he could tell, Mark was mouthing his name, calling out with increasing urgency. Stanley focused. He could make out the words, dreams, and 2 days. Stanley blinked. With each blink came maddening scenes, drowning fear and grotesque desires of consumption. His unconscious mind singularly consumed by an almost animalistic desire to feed. Stanley blinked again. He attempted to utter a word, but failed. His jaw fell open, tearing his cheek with it like a stressed fabric stitch. Mark appeared beside him and attempted to hold it in place. Stanley could only watch as his brother held him together. Suddenly, Mark backed away, his hands shaking. Stanley's bones cracked as he attempted to lower his gaze. He felt his loosened jaw move uselessly as he wheezed. There, forming a puddle on his lap, was a bloody mass of part of his jaw and a few teeth. All had practically dissolved in a yellowy white sludge that turned pink in the blood. Stanley stared down, his mind clouded in a red mist. Impulses flickered like static behind his eyes. Eat, feed, consume. Was his mind telling him to eat this, his brother took a step closer to him. Instinctually, Stanley's frail body lurched up from his chair, like an animalistic defense mechanism defending its food. His body crumpled to the floor. Several bones had seemingly dissolved below his skin, yet this did not deter Stanley from crawling across the floor towards Mark. Mark backed away in horror, shaking with fear. His skull had seemingly deformed in the fall from the chair. He now barely resembled his brother. After a moment, Stanley rolled onto his back, wheezing heavily. His eyes were held tightly shut. They burst open, and Stanley saw only the ceiling above his bed. Another terrible night. As the cold sweat subsided, Stanley's stomach growled with an insatiable hunger. Stanley climbed out of bed and walked to the kitchen. The treatment had, for lack of a better word, been effective. Stanley no longer struggled with the mundane tasks of walking or holding objects. He had regained full use of his limbs. Not only that, but he also felt stronger than he had for his entire life. He swung open the fridge and surveyed the food. Dead meat, lifeless plants, and artificial products. All made him feel sick as his stomach continued to growl. He swung open the cupboards, but nothing appealed to his stomach. Stanley, being a man with a rational mind, thought hard of different foods. It was not long before he recalled combined fragments of dream and memory as he muttered the words, "Live prey." He closed the kitchen cabinet and looked out to the window, into the veil of night. This was the last thing Stanley remembered clearly beyond the now excruciating pain in his stomach. The next morning, Mark found Stanley in the garden, asleep, somewhat concealed in the shade and overgrown bushes below the old apple tree. His hands, mouth, and white pajama shirt were all stained in blood, fur, and what appeared to be a handful of differently sized pet collars. Stanley slept for most of the day. Mark, who had been tracking the passing days carefully, consulted the calendar.
2 days,
he muttered to himself. 2 days would mark the same amount of time between treatment and the madness that had consumed the chimp. Mark, who had now destroyed the blood-stained pajamas and concealed evidence of what he could only assume were remnants of local wildlife and unfortunate pets that Stanley had no doubt hunted the night before, now stared blankly out of the window to the garden. His eyes fell upon the shed at the end of the garden where he had hidden from the police. A grim idea fell into his mind. He could hide Stanley, somewhere that he could not harm anyone or anything. Mark knew he was no killer. Until last night, he had thought the same of Stanley. Although he would not admit it, and as much as he wished it were not so, he had somewhat grown to resent Stanley. Not so much for his condition, nor any of his past actions prior to the death of their father. Rather, because of his brother's brilliantly stupid idea and quick reaction to lead the police to believe that he was dying and that Stanley was missing, also presumed dead. The lies and malleable gullibility of others. Stanley thrived on this, always considering himself cleverer than others. And now they were utterly alone. No one was coming to help them. Just Mark and his brother Stanley. Or rather, whatever Stanley was becoming. Even if his body was not physically transformed by the drug, Mark knew that his brother's obsessive nature had poisoned his mind beyond repair. Mark fell asleep that night, the calendar on his bedside, his thoughts repeating to the point of near insanity. Stanley still slept soundly in the next room.
The doors.
The words echoed around the bedroom, disturbing Mark from his sleep at once. He sat bolt upright, pinned to his bed by his sheets.
Stanley?
Mark asked, fear rising in his voice.
Every fucking door, every fucking window, locked, bolted, sealed,
Stanley said, his voice deep with a subdued rage.
Stanley,
Mark called out, moving, pulling his duvet from his lap and slowly moving to swing his legs over the side of his bed. He had never heard Stanley speak like this before. He attempted to keep his voice steady.
You know why?
Stanley had not yet appeared in his room. Mark's bedroom door was still slightly ajar, though a dancing shadow slightly visible in the hallway showed him slowly approaching.
There is no fucking food in the house,
Stanley roared suddenly. A fierce shove slammed the door open. Stanley's face was contorted with fury, his trembling hands covered with peeling flesh and blood.
I need food, Mark,
Stanley growled, his eyes growing wide with a ferocity that reminded Mark too much of the cornered chimp.
Mark,
Stanley said, his head tilting into a terrifying angle as he eyed his brother.
Let me out.
Calmly as he possibly could, as his blood trickled onto the carpet.
Stanley, you know I can't do that,
Mark said, now finally on his feet, his arms raised in front of him in preparation, in much the same way he had done when he was last cornered by a snarling beast. Stanley continued to watch Mark. His eyes settled on his outstretched hands, wandering down his wrist to the faded wound on his arm. Unmistakable indentations left in the skin that could come only from a fierce predatorial bite. The flashes in Stanley's mind rose like a flare, leaving only red as he lunged forward. Mark, prepared, leapt aside and grasped the lamp on his side table and struck Stanley fiercely. The various items from the surface of his table fluttered across the room by the stray cord. As Stanley lay unconscious, the wall calendar that had not been hung in its proper place for weeks, now due to Mark's constant annotations, fluttered to the ground beside Stanley's feet. Mark glanced at the alarm clock hanging from the edge of the table by its cord. Mark held it up slightly. midnight. It was the day they had been dreading, only it had come a day early. The end was here. Mark knew what had to be done.
2 days,
Mark scoffed, breathlessly. Chapter 6. The Transformation. Stanley stirred himself awake. A harsh, ringing sound issued in his ears from somewhere deep inside his head. Through the noise came a pain in his head that forced his eyes shut. He moved his hand towards his head, but found himself unable to reach his head. Sensation stirred in his body as it awakened, trailing behind his mind. He was sprawled on the floor, his limbs were strangely numbed. Finally, Stanley strained to open his eyes. Small spots of light were shining above him. Stars. He focused. No. Sunlight, passing through gaps in the wood. Dust dancing in the air above him. He looked around. Recognition of his garden shed came to him. Most men would begin to panic in this scenario waking up somewhere strange like this, but not Stanley. His rationality outweighed his emotion, it seemed. Stanley squinted and focused on the floor beside him. His broken glasses lay there. He looked past them to his arm. His wrists were bound in rope, his hands wrapped in duct tape. He followed the rope with his eyes. He was bound to an old wheelbarrow filled with old bags of compost, sandbags and old sacks filled with God knows what. Stanley pulled and strained, freeing himself just enough to sit up against the back wall of the shed. He looked down to see that his clothes had been removed, no doubt due to the copious amount of blood and viscera that remained on his clothes from last night's struggle. It was then he noticed the window, painted over from the outside. He could not see through, but could just make out his reflection. A man, now caged like an animal. The cruel irony was not lost on Stanley as he sat. A glimpse of the night the chimp arrived momentarily projected in his mind. His thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock from outside.
"Stanley,"
a hushed voice came from outside.
"are you awake?"
It was Mark.
"Yes,"
Stanley groaned.
"I'm sorry, Stanley. I had no—"
he began. Stanley did not hear his brother's words, for the writhing pain had returned with a vengeance as his body had now fully awoken. His skin was boiling, his muscles were burning, and his bones felt as though they might break through his flesh. The pain continued for hours. Little did Mark know that in these last moments of blurred distortion as he had awoken, before the intrusive pain overwhelmed him, were his brother's last moments of true cognitive control over his own body. His mind, however, remained intact, fully aware, and rational, albeit hidden, obscured by the madness that soon had Stanley straining against his restraints, attempting to claw at his flesh. Yet his hands were gloved by copious layers of duct tape, his teeth unable to reach anything but the air. Stanley felt something swelling in his throat. Then he could no longer scream, or produce any sounds for that matter. He coughed wheezily, and a lump of stray flesh that Stanley assumed to be his vocal cords torn clear from their proper place, launched across the shed. Stanley could only sit silently, hoping that the pain may cause him to pass out. Yet adrenaline continued to pump through his body, keeping him awake. Hours dragged painfully on, and to Stanley's immense relief, eventually his body mostly became numb. What would surpass the madness? There was no research, no evidence to provide any answers now. He could only observe the test subject, that was himself, staring at that broken mirror that showed a lying reflection of himself. Stanley could feel his bones writhing below his skin. They were no longer brittle. They were no longer stiff. Quite the opposite. They were softening, becoming malleable to contort into foreign places in bizarre configurations. With no ability to part his skin, huge fluid-filled blisters formed around his joints that grew larger and larger throughout the passing days. It felt as though his skin was hardening in other areas, particularly around his torso and chest. His ribcage seemed to spread whilst his spine seemed to shift upwards. Soon, his neck was engulfed into a solid mass that shifted his head upwards as his skull swelled outwards, resembling a hunched, almost reptilian structure with his adjoined spine. His frail arms hung loose at his side, emaciated with loose skin. Slackened against the restraint through the transformation, his duct tape binds around his hand had fallen away to expose the degloved flesh that was now his hand. No bones remained, only fluid. Stanley wondered why he had not yet died. 5 days without food or water. He could only assume that his body was absorbing nutrients from itself as it broke down. When Stanley awoke the following morning, his arm had almost been fully absorbed into his torso. His other arm had swollen grotesquely. Blood was pushing against the surface of his flesh to form tiny droplets where it was breaking the surface. It seemed to be pulsing of its own accord, like a churning stomach, as it was breaking itself down to stave off starvation. Stanley, who had not been able to move for days, made no attempts to resist. His legs had similarly formed into an inhuman mass of loose skin. His legs had formed into something that resembled a sleeping bag, or the body of a slug. His jaw had locked in place at an extremely uncomfortable jutting angle. He could now only open one eye, as the other had seemingly retracted into his skull. His remaining eye dared to wander to his reflection. He was horrified by the visage before him. There was no denying the metamorphosis was complete. Stanley was gone. Only this inhuman creature remained. Chapter 7. The Neighbor. Autumn had passed, and winter closed in. Mark still visited the shed sometimes, listening intently for any sound. He found himself reaching for the sealed door more than once, but stayed his hand before returning to the house. He could not bring himself to look. He could scarcely imagine the horrific scene inside. One night, as the temperature plummeted, Mark walked halfway down the garden automatically, before pausing abruptly. He sighed, his breath visible as a cloud before him, then reluctantly continued. He arrived at the sealed shed door and listened for a moment. Whilst he expected silence, today he could hear a faint shuffling and a cold, rattling breath from inside.
"Stanley,"
Mark whispered softly. He held his hand flat against the peeling wood door and waited. Had he imagined the sound? When there was no reply, he then allowed his hand to fall as he reluctantly turned back to the house. Then, a deep, raspy growl, like the snarl of a dog, combined with a drowning gurgle. Stanley, impossibly, was still alive. But as Mark's attention was drawn away, a sight had him freeze in place. There, looking down from the nearby house, in a brightly lit window, an elderly woman in her nightgown was staring back at him. Mark hurried back inside. How much had that woman seen? How much did she know? Before Mark had even turned on the light to his living room, came a knock at the front door. Not frantic, nor aggressive. Mark reluctantly walked to the front door and thought carefully. The glow of blue lights bloomed through the front curtain. He took a deep breath in preparation, then slowly opened the door. It was the same policewoman that had visited Stanley, what felt like an eternity ago. She wore a confused expression on her face as she looked back at him.
"Mr. Harris?"
she asked curiously.
"Dr. Harris. Stanley,"
Mark said plainly, imitating his brother's emotionless voice.
"Stanley Harris!" she exclaimed.
She frantically grabbed the radio from her belt and backed away. Before he knew it, Mark found himself in the back of a police car, being escorted to the station. Mark continued to present himself as Stanley. Of course, there were tests, but being a twin, these naturally rose no suspicion. The nurse at the station did note the bite on his arm. From this moment, Mark knew he had to come up with some convoluted story. He found himself attempting to think as Stanley would. In the ensuing interview, Mark discovered that his neighbor had seen him, and as Stanley was still assumed missing, she contacted the police immediately. Mark waited for the inevitable question about the shed, but strangely, this never came, as though this critical detail was omitted from his neighbor's report. Instead, Mark confessed to the police that he was simply scared that he would be blamed for the incident with the chimp.
"At least, at first."
He then fell silent for a moment.
"No."
Mark, who was posing as Stanley, said suddenly. He took a deep breath.
"Mark told me on several occasions that he resented being a burden. He told me that if he was going to die, then he wanted to do so alone, with dignity, and, well, I suppose he got tired of waiting for me."
Mark fell silent and solemn. Then, channeling the emotion Mark still held for Stanley, allowed his eyes to fill with tears before taking a deep, steadying breath.
"I admit, I went looking for him. For Mark."
The policewoman spoke suddenly, seemingly allowing Mark a moment to compose himself.
"The record shows that Mark Harris's physical condition was assessed as terminal and refused the support of doctors and social care,"
she began.
"Mark Harris has not been seen or heard from for months. If he was not home, and if his own brother was unable to find him, we can only presume,"
the policewoman concluded. It was past 3 a.m. when Mark was finally released from police custody. He did not spare a glance to the shed in the garden before collapsing down on his bed for the night. Tomorrow he would pay a visit to his neighbor and hopefully calm her down. He was already knocking on the door the next morning when a thought occurred to him. He was unsure if Stanley had ever introduced himself. He did not think that Stanley was the sort to do so. The door crept open before being restrained by the chain on the other side. A cautious face eyed Mark.
"Mrs. Diver, isn't it?"
Mark began, speaking in as calm and friendly a voice as he could.
"I do not believe we have formally met,"
he said, with a small smile. This faltered slightly, after an uncomfortable voice.
"No, I suppose we haven't,"
Mrs. Diver said, an unmistakable tone of relief in her voice.
"I was wondering if I might have a moment of your time,"
Mark began, but was interrupted by Mrs. Diver.
"I am so sorry. I didn't mean to. I just thought—"
she rambled, flustered.
"No, you misunderstand me. I am not upset,"
Mark said, changing to a reassuring tone as he took a step back from the door.
"I completely understand your concern. After all, rumours must be rife. As you can see, I have not been locked up, nor are the police here. I would like very much to start afresh if you would allow me to explain everything."
After an even longer and more indecisive pause, Mrs. Diver freed the chain on the door and invited Mark inside. They sat together in Mrs. Diver's conservatory, and Mark, as Stanley, explained simply that several months ago he took his terminally ill brother into his care. This was interrupted by that poor, sick animal attack. Then Mark admitted that at first he was terrified to return, fearing blame for the work of his laboratory. then concealed his search for his brother. To his surprise, Mrs. Diver proved to be a very calm, very patient, and above all, very understanding woman. Considering this, Mark chose his next words carefully.
I admit, I should have told you what was going on. Lord knows what you must have thought when the police arrived, and for that, I am sorry,
he said. This seemed to work.
Mr. Harris,
she began.
Please, Stanley,
Mark interrupted.
Stanley,
she corrected herself.
I will be honest as well. I am not the sort of woman to intrude on privacy. I confess I did not know who it was in the garden that night. I only saw someone creeping into a house, that I thought for a moment that someone might be trying to break in. I didn't want to cause any fuss, but...
She began to ramble, as flustered as she was at the door, something that Mark now understood as guilt. Mark reassured her again. The two decided that they would share a cup of tea together before Mark would return home. Mrs. Diver excused herself, leaving Mark a moment to look over his neighbour's exquisitely well-kept garden. Even in winter, whilst there were no vegetables or blooming flowers, the bare beds and emptied hanging baskets all stood ready for spring. His eyes wandered from Mrs. Diver's greenhouse to the adjacent fence, where he could just about make out the top of the shed. Then, as he watched, a deep gust of wind passed over the garden, causing multiple hangings and ornaments to sway. Mark's blood ran cold. The door to the shed swung ajar, lazily in the breeze. Stanley was free. Chapter 8. The Creature. The icy winter wind passed through the house as Mark returned. The sliding back door was wide open. Mark walked cautiously into the living room. He slid the door closed and locked it. He examined the trail of what appeared to be blood on the concrete outside that continued over the threshold, along the carpet and down the hall, towards the bedroom.
Stanley?
Mark called out instinctively, almost hopeful that his brother's voice would come from within. The door was slightly ajar when Mark approached, a steady, rattling breath coming from within. Mark, heart racing, pushed the door open. There, for the first time, he could clearly see what Stanley had become. An inhumanly tall creature, although hunched in appearance. His spine and neck stretched upwards from the cocoon-like mass below that was once his body. His legs were fused together, forming a singular thorax of peeling skin with the texture of tree bark, devoid of any remaining structural support from bone. His ribcage seemed painfully stretched open, the remaining skin or flesh that was still recognizable as skin, barely able to hold it inside. One arm similarly fused into his body, the other hanging limp at his side. His degloved hand hung as a cluster of flesh, pooling liquid oozing from the formless fingers. Mark's eyes studied him from bottom to top as Stanley turned to face him. The flaking, hardened scabs that met the carpet were dislodged and leaking blood where it had been pressed along the ground as Stanley shuffled on, explaining the trail Mark had followed. Mark met the creature's gaze. Stanley's skull had stretched and deformed his features beyond recognition. Now, only skeletal features remained on his head, where the spine had pushed and stretched his neck into a brutal angle. Only one of Stanley's eyes was still visible in its socket, a singular reminder of the man he had once been. Stanley's jaw hung open. Some teeth were missing. Some were grotesquely misshapen and enlarged. A sickening mixture of saliva, blood, and what appeared to be liquefied bone trickled from the corner of his mouth. A deep, wheezing growl came next. Stanley's body began to contort as it slowly leant over head first towards Mark. His jaw hung wider and wider, unhinging from its natural restraints in a snake-like manner, with a singular attempt of consuming its prey whole. More and more unpleasant bodily fluids now poured forth. Stanley did not move quickly. Each movement seemed to be agonizing to it. Mark did not back away. It was clear that there was no use. The affront to nature could not sustain itself for long. Sure enough, Stanley's stretched mouth ripped away from its body, swinging to one side before parting completely. Stanley's swollen tongue fell back into its gaping throat in a disgusting gurgle. Stanley's frame fell forward. The swollen balloon that were his legs popped gruesomely, partially dissolved bones floating in the lake of viscera. Now freed, Stanley's upper body rolled over to look up at Mark, clearly still intent on feasting. Stanley's shoulders seemed to strain against the skin, yet his arms remained motionless. Mark took a step closer, looking down, and seeing not his brother, but a dying animal, his heart and mind filling with only the desire to put this poor thing out of its misery. Stanley's eye rolled around in its socket and seemed to rest on Mark. The fluid filling his lungs was now audible. It was then that Mark saw the remaining humanity in his brother's eye. Mark blinked. The scene disappeared, replaced with a view of Stanley as he once was, not as a monster, not even as a man, but as a boy. His twin brother, his best friend as a child, a constant presence at his side. Mark was reminded of why he had agreed to take care of him, why he had sought him out after their father's funeral. In that split second, Mark came to a realization. Those boys who were once so much alike were now gone. Though this had nothing to do with Stanley's transformation, in truth he had lost his brother many years ago. Stanley's humanity disappeared long ago, long before this moment. Mark stepped away from his brother's side. There was nothing to be done. He closed the door softly, crossed the hallway, and with his back to the door, allowed his body to slide down until he was sat on the carpet, looking over at the door with tears in his eyes as he began to wait until the sounds of life died away. Whether it was through shock to his body or simply through this twisted, unnatural metamorphosis, Stanley felt an immense pressure around his heart. His torso, that was now almost indistinguishable from the rest of his body, was swelling, inflating, pulsating. A seam appeared down his sternum as his hardened cocoon-like flesh tore slowly. His remaining, almost alien innards were spilling out. Intestines, lungs, kidneys, stomach, all beyond recognition in the heap on the floor. Only his heart remained in place, still beating, but slowing. His opened ribcage drooped like sludge into the viscera below. Stanley's remaining eye watched his heart pulse for the final time before his vision fell into darkness. Stanley did not scream, only letting out a faint gurgle as the roof of his mouth collapsed, allowing the puddle of brain and sludge including a still attached eye, to fall through and hang from his slackened jaw. Of course, there were investigations, testimonials, but Mark seemingly had an answer and explanation for everything. Mark had destroyed the remains, and with access to chemicals and laboratory-grade cleaning equipment, was able to clear any trace of Stanley from the house. He sealed the shed at the end of the garden and allowed himself to forget as nature claimed it. Any small remains of Stanley would naturally rot away in time, or so Mark thought. He never breathed a word of what had become of his brother. There were many attempts to uncover the truth, even searches of his home. Mark expected to be caught one day. Perhaps he would inadvertently expose the truth himself. Unbeknownst to Mark, deep inside the enclosed garden shed, undisturbed by nature or man, the old shed floor that had absorbed expelled matter from Stanley proved to be a suitable host for a colony of insects born from the DNA of a parasite and man, forever growing, attempting to approximate the correct shape. As decades passed, they tried and failed to reform the body of the correct host, as they had done years before, each failure ending in a grotesque mass that would rot away, becoming fuel for the next attempt. Stanley Harris retired from his work officially in 1989. He kept to himself, never married, never traveled, rarely interacted with anyone. An ambulance was called on the 28th of December, 1998, where Stanley Harris was admitted into hospital and passed away peacefully overnight, though upon investigation of remains found inside an old shed, the remains of Stanley Harris were identified on the 13th of April, 2000, despite the notable impossibility of also being buried in a cemetery almost 5 miles away. The end.